And welcome to Atlanta. I'm Dave McHugh for D3Hoops.com. We're at Emory University. I'm joined by the Vice President for Division III, Dan Dutcher, on what has become a bit of an annual event, kind of a state of Division III with you. I appreciate you taking some time out of what is a very busy schedule this weekend to join us.
Thanks, Dave. My pleasure to be here.
We got a chat with you in Salem, and last year when you got a chance to check out the Final Four there. Of course, a little bit different this year. We're getting to play the championship game. Obviously, we should get a reaction from you. We talked about it a year ago. How has the year progressed to this point, and what do you think now of the games being here?
Well, it's great to be here. I'm just delighted with how this has all come together. To have the D2 and the D3 finals here in conjunction with the 75th anniversary of the men's Final Four. It's a great opportunity. It's been a lot of work by a lot of folks, which I'm really appreciative of. But ultimately, the opportunity to showcase Division III and the D3 finals as part of this event, I think is a great opportunity for us, and I really think it's going to pay off dividends in terms of raising the awareness of Division III athletics in a way that I'm really excited about.
When we talked a year ago, there were obviously a lot of questions. They were still trying to finalize exactly the details, the tournament structure, et cetera, and obviously it got dragged out just a little bit. But overall, the impressions that you have gotten from people about what this is, obviously we have not seen the game as of yet, but your overall impressions that you've received from people.
It's been really positive so far. The feedback that we've heard from the participating teams, the informal feedback so far, obviously we'll take a lot of time after this is over to get formal feedback from the participants. But so far, the informal feedback we've heard has been really positive, both from Amherst and Mary Hardin-Baylor. If last night's salute event is any indication, Division II and Division III are being prominently included in these events, and that's really what our ultimate goal was to be sure that we weren't lost in what's a very large and very important event. And so far, the feedback has been just the opposite. Division III is receiving prominent mention, and we're really grateful for that and excited about it.
I know the players have been excited about little tiny things like the police escorts to and from locations being included in the dinner, etc. It definitely seems like, not overly, but certainly an effort to make sure that they're getting the same treatment that the D1 guys get every time.
Yeah, and again, looking at the salute event last night as an example, the D3 teams were introduced on stage just like the D1 teams were. The D3 institution logos was featured along with the D1 and D2 institution logos. When you walked into the auditorium, they had placards that displayed all of the prior champions every year from all the previous Final Fours, and as well as for each of the Division II and Division III champions displayed in each year. So we're not being lost in this event so far. We're being prominently featured, and that's something that we were really hopeful for and are excited about.
We've talked about attendance for the game just haphazardly. I've said on the record many times that if we hit 5,000, I'm happy, because at least that's the number or better than what we've seen in Salem on some of the bigger occasions. If we see 10,000, I'll be ecstatic, and there's the potential certainly to see 10,000 because the game is free. But if it's under 5,000, if it's 2,000 or 3,000 people, I think there's a little bit of a worry that that's going to be our disappointment. What are your expectations from everything you've been hearing?
Well, I think the timing for us is good at 12:30 on Sunday. There aren't a lot of other events going on. The events schedule sort of picks up as the weekend goes on, as that Sunday schedule evolves. I'm optimistic because I think we have a good time frame. I wouldn't want to judge the experience simply by the number of fans who show up for the game, however. But I am optimistic that we're going to have a good attendance on Sunday.
Now, to flip the coin a little bit, we talked a year ago about the fact that there was a thought that this should be reciprocated on the women's side as well, that this experience on the men's side should also be honored on the women's side of things. What's the latest there? Stevens Point only has a one-year contract for next year's Final Four. Normally those are two-year things. There's certainly indications that is the direction everybody's headed, but is there a timeline in place? Is there expectation in place?
No timeline yet. The commitment and principle is there that we need some kind of comparable recognition and experience for our women, and I'm confident that that will happen, but we really haven't identified a specific date that makes the most sense. If you think about the selection of this date, for the men, obviously it coincides with the 75th anniversary of the men's championship. We don't have a similar kind of event coming up in the near future for the women, and so we need to find a date that makes sense, that's appropriate, but the commitment to have a comparable experience for our women was very clearly articulated by our President's Council and Management Council, and I'm confident that that will happen.
Should we read into anything that Stevens Point only got a 1 year? Is that trying to set up something in an odd year format here, that Stevens Point gets a year, then there's going to be another 2 year, or I mean, is there anything to read into that?
Not to my knowledge, no. I wouldn't read too much into that. I just think that's the way that the bid cycles have been playing out. There's been, I think, a conscious effort throughout all of our championships to look at our bid cycles and to reassess how those are being offered and awarded, and I think that that's really, with basketball, just part of that broader overview and sort of resetting of our bid process.
Speaking of bids, it seems like there's a bit of a transition taking place. Obviously, Salem has hosted the men's Final Four for years. A number off the top of my head escapes me, but I know it's been a very long time. On the women's side, we've gotten now into the every 2 year, for the most part, process. Hope, then Illinois Wesleyan, back to Hope. Now it's going to Stevens Point. We've been in a process with that. But soccer, for example, San Antonio seems to be developing into a home. Baseball, developing into a little bit of a home. Is there a sense of trying to create now maybe a location that is the goal, kind of like a Salem on the men's side? Or is it just happenstance that it's, a location is putting together 2 year bids that are good and no one's able to maybe take those bids away?
Well, I think when you talk about where the championships take place, ultimately you want to conduct those championships at locations that maximize the student-athlete experience. And first and foremost, that's really what we're trying to accomplish. If you look at places like Salem that have such an established track record of hosting championships, they deliver such a good experience for our student-athletes that sometimes if it's not broke, you don't want to fix it kind of approach, I think, which we see articulated by our sport committees. Where we go ultimately is a function of the sport committees and their recommendation to the championships committee and on up to our management council and president's council. That process will remain, but we really, I think, need to recognize and give deference to the judgment of our sports committees when it comes to trying to identify what are the locations that work best. It may be that for some sports you see certain locations consistently delivering, they get deference on a longer term basis, whereas other locations may have a kind of experience that encourages different locations on a rotational kind of basis. So I really think it's important to make those decisions on a sport specific basis, and that seems to be the approach that we're taking.
Speaking with Dan Dutcher, Vice President for the Division III in the NCAA, let's transition a little bit. A lot of changes on the horizon in Division III. We start with regional realignment in 2 years, but also changes to regional structure and regional games next year across the board. Essentially, all games count as long as you play 70% of your games in region. Tell me a little bit about that evolution. I'm sure there's still questions to be solved and answered in the summer here before we really enter that next fall, but is everything really set for that? Are there still some loopholes trying to be closed?
Yeah, I think it's been a very long and a very detailed review process where we've really had to rely on our sports committees first and foremost, and then our championships committee to really work out what are the appropriate regional alignments in the various sports. So we've sort of had a two-pronged approach where we've reassessed what are the appropriate regional alignments, and at the same time, as you referenced, we've increased from 50 to 70% the minimum number of contests that have to take place within region. We're still defining region pretty broadly, so it's any institution that's within your conference, that's within your geographic region, or within that 200-mile radius. Right. Another concept that's receiving review is the idea that even if you don't meet any of those first three criteria, an institution that's within a contiguous state could also be considered to be within region.
My next question. I was
so
go to that.
You know, that's another concept that's under review. I don't think we'll probably ever be fully settled on reviewing what's the most appropriate way to deal with that regional concept. But I would go back to the principle that's in our philosophy statement that says in Division III, primary emphasis on competition is supposed to be on regional and conference competition. That's really fundamental for Division III. That's the way to emphasize local competition to minimize missed class time. And that principle, I think, is what we ultimately need to be sure that we keep in mind when we review all of these other options about, in practice, how to put that principle into play.
Another question regarding regional games that's been brought up many times by fans is a scenario with the MIA, for example, in Michigan, of dealing with not being able to get that 200 miles because a darn lake is in their way of trying to play some teams, but using the using the line, and so a game in Illinois would automatically count, or a game in Wisconsin would automatically count, even if they have to travel more than 200 miles around the lake. Are those kinds of proposals also on the table?
That's a good example of the kind of flexibility that we would probably continue to want to explore when it comes to revising and refining those definitions. That's where you have to really look and rely on the expertise of your sports committees and the championships committee to make the ultimate call. But there are examples that make sense. We don't want to close our door to those.
Of course, the other thing about regional games next year is all games really will count towards regional rankings and et cetera, as long as they play that 70%. So we are starting to see expansion of at least allowing teams to have good contests, or any contests really, across the board, as long as they're still keeping the regional mentality.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. For years, we've heard some folks who have sort of advocated this concept we call a game is a game, which would have basically done away with any regional consideration. When you look at, again, the philosophy statement that emphasizes that regional concept, I certainly didn't feel, and I think the governance structure felt, it wasn't appropriate to completely do away with any kind of regional requirement. But the new policy that's being implemented, I think, really sets a nice approach, because it retains overall emphasis on regional competition, but it does, beyond that 70%, give you an opportunity to play other contests that you might feel it's appropriate for your institution to play without sacrificing your championships access. So this new concept, it's the result, again, of a lot of review and a lot of discussion over the last couple of years, and I think we've landed in a pretty good place, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in practice.
Per regional realignment, we know it's going to be, it's coming in a year, and we know what those, I know it's been years of coming together, but my question is, why isn't that being instituted maybe next fall? It's not so shockingly different. The games are now open to be played all over. You just have to play 70% in region. Well, for most of these shifts, they were already going to be getting to that point anyway from where they're located. Why isn't that a quicker decision? One of the conferences is already shifting next year. Why couldn't we just do it across the board?
I think the delay, my guess is, it was probably designed to try to accommodate situations where schedules have already been established, and to give folks some lead time in scheduling based on the new criteria, recognizing that some of next year's schedules in many sports may have already been put in place.
Sure. Of course, that will come, but obviously it's ever changing. We got the regional realignment coming. Are we done, or is this always a moving thing that we could in a couple of years go, listen, we still need to make some adjustments?
You know, I think around the edges you're always going to have individual requests to committees for consideration of adjustments. I would say the comprehensive review is probably over and done and will be in place for a significant period of time. But again, we never want to close the door to potential recommendations and adjustments that enhance our student-athlete experience and make sense.
Of course, part of regional realignment is because Division III continues to grow. And doesn't seem to be ending. We still see an influx of schools every year. More schools are applying to become. A couple questions about growth. First and foremost, are we at a point, I think I've asked this before, that we're maybe getting too big, or are we still comfortable with the size and where the future is?
You know, the growth has not been as robust as it was in the last decade, for example. We're probably on track now to be at about 447 or so schools when you count our actives and our provisionals. It's interesting to note that over the last couple of years, we've had a handful of schools that have actually decided to leave Division III, either because they've dropped their sports program, like Spelman, or they've decided to pursue the Division II model instead. When you go back to the middle of the last decade, when we were trying to project how large the division would be, we actually talked about being as large as 480 schools by 2020. I don't think we'll get there. I think those projections may have been a little too aggressive. We haven't seen as much growth as we thought we would see at that time. But I think the fundamental point regarding your question remains important. We continue to grow. We need to be sure that we accommodate that in the most appropriate way. I don't get a sense from our membership that folks feel that we've become too big. I think that the primary concern I hear articulated by our members is we're comfortable with being as big as folks want to get, provided that the institutions that join us are committed to the Division III philosophy. Sure. If they're a good fit philosophically, if they're a good fit practically when it comes to sports sponsorship and on the legislative commitments, that's just fine. That's appropriate. D3 can be a Big Ten as long as everyone's committed to the same principles.
Of course, there's also growth in sports. Basketball, not necessarily. When new schools come in, certainly that adds to sports. Right. But, for example, men's and women's lacrosse is growing quite a bit in Division III. Almost, it seems like every day I hear about another school who's going to be adding a program in the next year or two, or bringing in a club sport to make it intercollegiate. Have you been surprised by any of the sports growths? Have you been surprised by any of the sports lack of growth, maybe?
You know, I think it's really interesting how Division III institutions added sports during the last 5 or 6 years, even though the economy was challenged. And it's important to note in Division III how many institutions sponsor sports for enrollment and retention purposes. The fact that so many students in Division III are student athletes, the average, being around 20%, but at many schools it's 30% and more. The recognition by many schools that sport can really serve a positive role in attracting students to the institution and keeping them at the institution. So I think that's why you'll see institutions adding sports and being very comfortable with the role that athletics plays at their institution, even in a tough economic environment.
Talking with Dan Dutcher, Vice President for Division III, the NCAA. We're at Emory University here on Final Four weekend in Atlanta, and we'll explain why we're here in Emory in just a moment, but let me get to a couple of the nitty-gritty type stuff. New Jersey has been a big focus for the NCAA, obviously, with the passing of sports gambling legislation by the state. Of course, it's been in and out of the court system, and as of last check, and I could be wrong, but I believe the NCAA has lifted the ban on tournament games being played in New Jersey, having the fact that New Jersey lost its appeal, or somebody lost its appeal in federal court. Though the process isn't over yet. I mean, we know there probably is another appeal process coming. This could go as high as the Supreme Court since it's a federal issue. Is this going to be one of these games where if, let's say, the next round New Jersey wins, then we put the mandate back in place that there's no tournament games? Or are they, let's start with that first.
Well, I think it's important to note that the executive committee policy that applies in this case is really what we're following, and that policy really emphasizes that we will not award championships to states that permit sports gambling. Right. The scenario that's played out so far in New Jersey, it's not unlike the scenario that played out several years ago in Delaware, where Delaware adopted legislation that attempted to establish a sports book. That legislation, I want to emphasize, is contrary to federal legislation. The litigation reinforced the fact, based on court rulings, that yes, the state legislation was inconsistent with federal legislation. And in the Delaware scenario, that reached a definitive end where the state did not appeal that decision. We followed a very similar scenario so far with the New Jersey legislation. The federal legislation is clear that New Jersey is not eligible to adopt a sports book.
Just for the record, they had the opportunity a year after the law was passed to put it in place and would have been exempt. But they did not choose that, so that's why we're in this boat now.
And beyond when New Jersey did adopt the legislation, it was contrary to federal legislation. Right. The NCAA was joined by several of the professional sporting associations, leagues, and litigated that fact. The court most recently has reached a definitive statement that that's not appropriate. I don't know where the state will go next, and certainly they might decide to appeal that decision. But the reason why our leadership felt that New Jersey could again sponsor championships was, at this point, the litigation seems to have reached a definitive point. Now, if an additional round of
right.
litigation is triggered, that might call into question whether we've reached an endpoint on this discussion, and if so, I would imagine that New Jersey's opportunity to, New Jersey institutions and their opportunity to host will probably become another item of discussion.
I know there's been discussion in Division III that the President's Council could very well go to the NCAA should a ban be put back in place. Go, listen, this is maybe too harsh on at least Division III student athletes where no games are being bet on, et cetera, et cetera. You've pulled some tournaments out of here already. We've seen some teams have to be creative to be able to, quote unquote, host a game. Have you heard of anything where the President's Committee and Council would be possibly presenting something to the executive group saying, listen, can we at least look at where this is really being effective and where it's not?
I have not, and certainly institutions could ask the executive committee to review any aspect of the current executive committee policy. But at the same time, I think it's important to note the executive committee works on behalf of the entire association. The policy right now covers the entire association. Would it make sense to develop a division-specific policy? I'm wondering whether that would be a wise move in the minds of the executive committee.
Of course, Division I NCAA has been under attack a lot. Investigations that haven't worked out well, and we won't go into all the details. Other things that have happened in Division I that has certainly raised questions, and people have attacked the NCAA. Are you feeling that in the Division III level, that some of the stuff is trickling down in some senses? Have there been any issues? I know we've had some minor ones in Division III, relatively speaking. Is there any pressure in Division III or any negative look at the NCAA because of what's going on above you?
Well, I think it's always important to note that folks who aren't NCAA insiders, if you will, folks who aren't directly involved in athletics administration, folks in the general public, for example, tend to paint with a very broad brush.
Sure.
They don't necessarily understand that there are even 3 divisions, let alone how those divisions are identified and what makes them distinct. And so for many folks, any kind of negative publicity or criticism that's levied at the NCAA, in their minds, applies to all 1,000 NCAA schools and conferences, and Division III can be affected by that. That's one of the reasons why it's so important for Division III to try to better define its identity. That's one of the reasons why we launched the Division III Identity Initiative several years ago. That's why we remain committed to it. We think it's really important for folks to understand what Division III is about, what makes it unique, what distinguishes it from the other divisions. It remains a focal point for us from a strategic perspective, as well as in terms of where we're allocating our resources. I won't say the work is done. There's a lot of work in front of us. We can't accomplish that goal simply through the national office. That's a goal that can only be accomplished through the combined efforts of our entire Division III membership, all 445 of our member institutions, all of our athletics administrators, all of our conference commissioners. Together, we need to do a better job of articulating what the division is about, what makes us unique, and that's important. That's important for us for many reasons.
I think another concern that a lot of people have, or not concern, but certainly a question, we see a lot of money, especially from the D1 basketball tournament, that comes into the NCAA. We know that D3 gets a percentage of it, but it sometimes feels like that percentage isn't being met, or obviously we don't know where all the money goes. I'm not asking for a budgetary item here, but is there a thought of expanding how much money Division III gets? It's a very small percentage of that big contract. Is there ever ways of showing how that money is being allocated to Division III in some sense?
Well, we get 3.18%.
That's less than I thought it was.
Off the top of the annual NCAA revenue. We get it off the top. It's constitutionally guaranteed. I think it's important to note when I say constitutionally guaranteed, that means any change in that allocation would have to be approved by the entire NCAA membership,
Right.
not just Division III. It's not it's not a figure that we have autonomy over. But keep in mind, 3.18%, because the NCAA pie is so large, that 3.18% slice is still about $25 million this year. We spend about 75% of our budget to fund our championships program, and then the other 25% for our non-championship initiatives. $25 million is a lot of money. I would never say we wouldn't take more, but the reality is that the $25 million really provides our opportunity to conduct a robust championships program, very significant non-championship initiatives. We're very pleased with the opportunities that it presents for us, and I don't think it probably is just realistic to talk about any kind of change in that allocation at this point.
It'd be nice, though, if you mentioned those numbers. 5% would just even sound great. Well, now, of course, we are at Emory University. Again, Vice President of Division III, Dan Dutcher, joining me here. And we're at Emory because, one of the great things that I know Division III has embraced in the last few years and in gangbusters is community service, and especially Special Olympics. We're about to have an opportunity where the two teams, Amherst, Mary Hardin, and Baylor, are going to be participating in an event here. This is something we're all familiar with in Salem. We are starting to see it certainly grow in other locations and other championships. But how important has this been for Division III?
Well, I think it's just been a great partnership with Special Olympics. For us, it's really been a great experience. When we talk about what Division III is supposed to be about and what the Division III student-athlete experience is supposed to be about, of course, we always emphasize success in the classroom, first and foremost, and success on the playing field as well. But for our Division III student-athletes, we want them to have opportunities for success in a third venue, and that's through community service, co-curricular and extracurricular activities. For Special Olympics, our student-athletes have really embraced that as our official community service partner because of the educational value it provides. Yeah. Obviously, it provides an educational value to the Special Olympic athletes, but all of our feedback tells us it provides just as much, if not more, of an educational value to the student-athletes who participate. Really thrilled to say we've had over 250,000 hours dedicated to support Special Olympics by our Division III student-athletes. We've conducted Special Olympic activities now at every Division III championship. The message that it sends to our student-athletes and to the public really is consistent with what we say Division III is about, and that is to be involved in the community, to learn through athletics participation, to focus on a collegiate experience that is broad-based. Those are values that are consistent for Division III and that are consistent with the Special Olympics organization. They're an incredible organization to work with. They exist in every state. They're very organized. They're very enthusiastic. They make it easy for our member institutions and our student athletes to be involved. Couldn't be more delighted with how that partnership has evolved over time, and to have our two final teams here today cool. To be involved. It just really, I think, puts a nice capstone on the activities this weekend.
And it's really part of that YD3, the hashtag that has certainly gained notoriety in the last few years. And obviously there's other community service events that take place, awareness for cancers and other things that take place that really have been also the true YD3. So it seems like Special Olympics is kind of the base for a much bigger scope of community service, being aware of your community and giving back, which seems interesting considering the student athletes aren't getting scholarships to play. They're not taking anything necessarily from the schools. They're giving to the schools, and they're also giving to the community. It seems like a very interesting relationship.
It really is a great relationship, and I think it helps to reinforce the kind of educational experience we want our student athletes to have. It's an educational experience that you derive from participating in intercollegiate athletics, from participating in community service and campus kinds of activities, as well as in the classroom. That's how our Division III student athletes learn. That's the essence of the Division III experience. You and I have talked about before, we don't conduct athletics in Division III because it makes money or because it provides public entertainment. We really provide those athletic programs because of the educational value it provides to our student athletes. And it's important to emphasize that educational opportunity that exists outside of the classroom, off the playing field. It helps to position our student athletes to become good citizens and leaders after their collegiate career is over, and that's the kind of learning that Special Olympics activity can provide.
The future of the YD3 initiative is, what do you guys have hopes and goals in mind?
You know, we continue to give emphasis to it. It remains a priority in our strategic positioning platform. In terms of allocating resources, it remains a priority for us. It just remains important for us to continue to tell the D3 story because it's such a strong and powerful story, and it's going to remain a top priority for us.
We said at the beginning this was a state of D3. What is the state of D3 if you were giving your state of the state, as it were, or your Mark Emmert press conference, so it's just me asking questions?
Well, you know, I don't want to steal too much thunder from our management council and president's council, but we conducted our first division-wide survey this past spring. It's the first one we've conducted in 5 years. And I can tell you that I think the state of the division is really very good. We asked folks about philosophical issues. We asked them about legislative standards. We asked them about our various programs and services, communication, the governance structure. Across the board, feedback was really very positive. Folks seem to be happy with where we're at as a division. They believe that we're backing up our philosophical principles in practice. They're pleased with how we operate as a division from a representative standpoint, and that's really important because ultimately the NCAA in Division III, it's a representative member association. We need to be sure that our actions are consistent with the will of our membership. The feedback has really been encouraging so far. We're still compiling the results of the survey, but the preliminary results are supportive of the concept that D3 is in a good place. And we just want to review those results, see what we're doing well, see where we can improve, and commit to doing that moving forward.
He is Dan Dutcher, Vice President for Division III for the NCAA. As you know, I always give my guests the final word. Any final thoughts you want to share with those who may be watching? You
know, I would just encourage all of folks who are out there to not hesitate to be advocates for the division. Division III is doing a lot of things right. It's a great model. Don't hesitate to take advantage of those opportunities to tell the D3 story and be proud of your association with Division III.
I think we've committed ourselves to doing this yearly, so we're going to have to find out where we cross paths in the next year as well. Again, Dan Dutcher, Vice President for Division III at the NCAA. Appreciate you taking the time to do so. And we'll have plenty more from Atlanta throughout the weekend, so stay logged on to d3hoops.com.